The winter of 1838 wrapped Black Hollow, Iowa, in a silence so complete it seemed even the wind had lost the will to howl. Snow lay thick on the narrow dirt road leading into town, its surface broken only by the wheel tracks of a single carriage. The horse that pulled it was thin and deliberate in its pace, as though carrying not just weight but something unspoken. Sitting at the reins was a man in a dark wool coat, his collar pulled high against the cold, a wide-brimmed hat shadowing his pale face. His name was Elias Fallow, though he did not offer it until asked, and even then he spoke it as if it were only half his. When Elias stepped into the small general store that doubled as a post office, the room warmed slightly, not from his presence but from the way he moved, slow and careful, as if to avoid startling the air. He introduced himself as a traveling apothecary, his voice low but even, explaining that the harsh winter and distance from larger towns must leave Black Hollow in need of remedies. He spoke of dried herbs, tinctures and poultices that could ease the coughs and fevers that plagued every family in the cold months. He did not speak of the small locked trunk that never left his sight. The town, starved for any novelty, welcomed him without question. The pastor's wife invited him to Sunday service, and the blacksmith offered to sharpen his knives in exchange for a cure to his wife's aching joints. The children followed him in the street, fascinated by the glass bottles that clinked softly in his satchel. Elias smiled when they looked at him, but not with warmth. His eyes seemed to study each child the way one might examine a painting, measuring lines, shapes, the way shadows fell on skin. At night he rented a single upstairs room above the tavern. The barkeep heard him moving long after midnight, the faint scrape of metal and the soft rustle of paper. Elias kept a leather-bound ledger on the small desk by the window, and by candlelight he filled its pages not with lists of medicines but with drawings. Faces he had seen in town that day captured in uncanny detail. Each sketch was numbered, each marked with brief, almost clinical observations. Eyes narrow when smiling, mouth tense, sorrow beneath. The snow kept falling, muting the edges of the world. Elias moved from house to house, offering cures to colicky infants and frostbitten farmers. He listened more than he spoke, asking about the health of family members when they last laughed, if they dreamed. He never took notes in public. Only later in his room would he sit for hours over a drawing, his hand steady, his gaze fixed as if the paper itself were alive. In the warmth of a family's kitchen, he would linger after delivering medicine, watching as a wife poured him coffee or as a child recited a verse from memory. He studied how their expressions shifted with each word, how joy touched the corners of the mouth but rarely reached the eyes. He seemed to be waiting for something in those moments, though no one yet realized it. By the second week, he had become part of the town's daily rhythm. The pastor spoke of him during service, calling him a blessing in a time of need. Elias stood in the back pew, head bowed, though his eyes moved constantly, noting the way grief sat on a widow's lips, how a farmer's laughter broke too quickly, how a child's shy smile bent at a perfect angle. These were not observations of kindness. They were measurements, calculations, silent marks in an unseen design. No one questioned the small glass vials he carried in his coat pocket, or why the contents shimmered faintly even in dim light. No one asked why. After tending to the sick, he would take long walks alone past the frozen pond, his footprints leading to the edge and then circling back. His presence was quiet, almost invisible, yet somehow it began to settle over Black Hollow like an invisible frost, felt but unseen. The night before his third Sunday in town, Elias sat in his room with the candle burning low. He turned to a fresh page in his ledger and began to draw the face of the blacksmith's wife. Her eyes softened by pain, her mouth caught halfway between relief and resignation. When he finished, he wrote only one word beneath the sketch: "Candidate." Then he closed the book, locked the trunk at his feet, and blew out the candle, leaving the room in darkness. The quiet arrival of Elias Fallow was complete. What had begun as a gesture of help had already rooted itself in the marrow of the town. They saw him as a healer, but in truth he had come to study something far older than illness, something that would only be understood when it was far too late. The days that followed wove Elias Fallow deeper into the fabric of Black Hollow, though few realized how carefully he was stitching himself into their lives. The snow kept the town small and inward-facing, and Elias used that closeness like a craftsman uses fine tools. Every visit, every shared cup of tea was another quiet measurement, another entry in a record no one knew existed. At night, his upstairs room glowed faintly through the tavern's frosted window, the light of his candle flickering over pages that were not medical notes but portraits. The ledger itself was a thing of obsession. Bound in dark leather worn smooth at the edges, it had no title on its spine. Its pages were thick, made to hold the deep strokes of graphite and the occasional streak of reddish-brown pigment. Each page bore a single face, drawn with such precision it could have been mistaken for a miniature painting. Beneath every likeness were small marks in an orderly script. Lips curve at 5 degrees, brows ease with downward gaze, eyes half close at approach of warmth. No one in Black Hollow could have imagined that these observations were not the detached musings of an artist, but measurements for something Elias was building in his mind. He kept to a schedule. Morning hours were for tending to the sick or delivering remedies, the work of a man devoted to health. But as afternoon sank into the long shadows of winter, he would retreat to his room and lay out his instruments. A wooden case held a set of thin silver calipers for measuring the width between eyes or the length of a smile. A small glass jar contained a paste that smelled faintly of bitter almonds, which he would sometimes smear along the lines of his sketches, studying how it dried. His methods were not those of a healer. They were the calculations of someone shaping something permanent. When he returned to the streets, he carried the ledger under his coat, always pressed close to his chest. He did not open it in public, but it was clear he was looking at the people he passed with a kind of inner overlay, as though he could see the measured numbers floating over their features. A merchant's wife laughed with her head tilted just so. Elias slowed his step, committing the angle to memory. A young boy scowled at being sent indoors. Elias noted the tension in the jaw. Every face was raw material. Even the townsfolk who found him strange saw it as harmless eccentricity. The pastor's wife told others that the apothecary simply has an artist's soul. Elias let them think so, knowing the truth would make their skin crawl. Art was too soft a word for what he was doing. He was collecting data, expression by expression, until he could control them, not on paper but in flesh. Some evenings the barkeep would hear faint rhythmic tapping from Elias's room, the sound of pencil against paper interrupted by the occasional scrape of metal on glass. On those nights Elias was refining the details, how much pressure on the zygomatic muscles created a natural smile, how far the lips could stretch before appearing grotesque. He was not guessing. He was experimenting. Somewhere someone had already been made to hold a smile too long. By the end of his third week, the ledger held over 40 faces. Some were drawn in peaceful repose, others in subtle distress. A few bore an expression almost identical to joy, but with the eyes fixed and glassy, the vitality missing. These Elias revisited often, his pencil tracing the lines over and over as though deepening a groove in his mind. It was in those late hours, alone with the ledger, that Elias allowed himself a thin smile. He was close to creating a method that could take a fleeting human moment and trap it forever, sealing it into the face like an insect in amber. And when that happened, the town would no longer be simply a place he visited. It would become his gallery. Downstairs, the tavern's last patron stumbled home, unaware that above their heads a man sat in the half-light, turning the pages of a book that catalogued them one by one, as surely as if they were already gone. The snow had begun to thaw in slow, wet patches, revealing the black soil beneath. Winter was loosening its grip on Black Hollow, but the thaw brought with it a kind of unease, as if the land itself was bracing for something it could not name. Elias Fallow moved through the change of season without hurry, his satchel swinging gently at his side, the glass vials inside clinking softly. He had finished a new set of entries in his ledger, faces sharpened by cold air, softened by firelight, all of them ready for his study. It was the blacksmith's boy, Samuel, who first caught his full attention. 14 years old, with a restless spirit that made him wander after chores. Samuel had the kind of smile that began with a flicker in the eyes, and only then found the mouth. Elias had seen it in the shop while delivering a tincture for the blacksmith's wife, and the moment lodged in his mind. Over the next week he sought out reasons to be near the boy, offering to bring tonics for his father's aches, leaving sweets wrapped in wax paper under the counter when Samuel was sent to fetch supplies. On a gray morning, when the clouds pressed low and the wind carried the scent of melting snow, Samuel stopped by Elias's room above the tavern. He claimed he had a cough and wondered if the apothecary could mix him something strong enough to keep his father from worrying. Elias welcomed him in, closing the door with a quiet click. The room was dim but warm, lit only by a single candle and the dull glow from the small iron stove. On the table lay the ledger, open to a blank page. Elias spoke gently, his voice steady as he poured water into a kettle and measured out herbs from glass jars. The boy relaxed, unaware that the steam carried more than just the scent of chamomile and mint. As Samuel sipped from the cup Elias handed him, his breathing slowed, his limbs growing heavy. He tried to set the cup down, but his fingers felt strange, unresponsive. Elias watched closely, leaning in to study the shifting muscles in the boy's face. When the paralysis took hold, Samuel could still see, still hear, still think, but his body no longer obeyed him. Elias knelt before him, lifting his chin with 2 fingers, his gaze locked on the boy's mouth. With precise, almost reverent movements, he adjusted the corners of Samuel's lips, pressing gently here, lifting there, until the expression was exactly as he wanted, serene, joyful, untouched by fear. The eyes, though, still held awareness. Elias whispered something only the boy would ever hear, and the words made his pupils tighten. By the time the draft's deeper compounds reached his heart, Samuel's face had been fixed. Elias worked quickly, applying a thin coat of resin along the jawline and beneath the cheekbones, sealing the shape before rigor mortis could shift it. He placed the boy upright in a wooden chair near the stove, folding his hands neatly in his lap. For a moment he simply observed, memorizing the arrangement as though it were the first in a long series of exhibits. That night a neighbor found the chair in the old smokehouse behind the tavern. Samuel sat there as though waiting for someone, his smile soft and unsettling in the flicker of lantern light. There were no wounds, no signs of struggle, only that perfect, unblinking joy on his face. The coroner, unskilled in such mysteries, declared it a sudden illness, perhaps brought on by the season's lingering dampness. The town mourned, but they found comfort in the peaceful look he carried into death. Elias stood in the back at the burial, his hat in hand, eyes lowered. No one noticed how still he was, how the corners of his own mouth twitched in satisfaction when the casket was lowered into the ground. That night, in the quiet of his room, he opened the ledger to the page he had prepared and began to draw Samuel's face exactly as it had been in the smokehouse. When the sketch was done, he traced the smile with his fingertip as if sealing it once more. Beneath the drawing, he wrote, "Perfect." Black Hollow would not call it a disappearance. They had found him after all. But in truth, something had vanished. It was not just a boy they buried. It was the first piece of the town's soul. And Elias had taken it without leaving so much as a trace of force. Do you want me to move straight into Chapter 4? Remedies for the soul so the momentum keeps tightening? Spring pressed itself into Black Hollow in hesitant steps, the ground thawing in places while frost still clung stubbornly in the shadows. Samuel's death had been folded into the quiet rhythm of the town, discussed in lowered voices for a week or two before slipping into that category of tragedies people convince themselves they've accepted. Elias Fallow moved among them with the same calm purpose as before, his reputation untarnished. If anything, the tragedy seemed to give his presence more weight. The widowed mothers, the weary fathers, they all saw in him a man who could ease suffering. Elias began offering a new service, not in the open but in hushed suggestions. He called it a comfort draft, a tonic for those burdened by sleepless nights or unshakable grief. He claimed it slowed the mind enough for the heart to breathe, as if allowing sorrow to settle quietly instead of gnawing at the bones. For those still aching from the winter's losses, the promise was irresistible. Few asked what was in the draft, trusting the apothecary who had never refused help to anyone. His formula was not an accident. Each vial contained a layered mixture of herbal sedatives, mild muscle relaxants, and something darker. Something Elias had spent years perfecting in places where no one thought to look. The compounds were subtle enough that a person could take the first sip without realizing the edge they were crossing. Within minutes, their body would slow, a warm heaviness sinking into their limbs. Their mind would drift somewhere between waking and sleep, conscious enough to feel but powerless to resist. This was when Elias would act. Sitting close, his voice calm and measured, he would shape their features with the precision of a craftsman. A gentle press beneath the cheekbone, a light pull at the corner of the mouth, a thumb resting just long enough at the chin to tilt it into a look of serene acceptance. His hands were steady, his movements deliberate, as though arranging flowers for a table no one else would see. He wasn't erasing pain. He was replacing it, sculpting the moment of death into something that would linger far beyond life. For the townsfolk who awoke from these visits, because not every draft was fatal, there was no memory of those minutes, only a faint soreness in the jaw or a strange stiffness in the cheeks that faded by morning. But for those Elias chose not to wake, their final moments were sealed in resin before their hearts stopped beating. He had perfected the timing. The smile was fixed while life was still present, making it appear genuine in a way that could deceive even the sharpest eye. One evening Elias visited the widow Grace Lorne, who had not left her bed in weeks since her infant died in the cold snap. Her home smelled of damp wood and fading milk. She agreed to drink the comfort draught, desperate for any relief. As the warmth spread through her body, Elias adjusted her posture in the chair near the hearth, tilting her head just enough for the firelight to catch the curve of her lips. He whispered something to her, something soft and final, and her eyes glistened. Not in fear, but in a strange, empty calm. When she stopped breathing, her face looked as though she had just seen her child again. The town marveled at the peace on her features when she was found, saying Elias had given her rest at last. They began to speak of him as more than a healer, as someone touched by a kind of divine grace. Elias let them believe it, never boasting, never drawing attention to the quiet frequency of such merciful passings in his wake. In his ledger, Grace's face took its place beside Samuel's, the sketches growing into a gallery that only he would ever see in its entirety. Each page was numbered, each one an answer to a question no one had yet thought to ask. And somewhere in the stillness of his work, Elias knew the truth. He was no longer simply studying expressions. He was collecting them, one by one, as though assembling the perfect choir of smiles to outlast the people who wore them. By early summer, the air in Black Hollow carried the scent of tilled earth and growing corn. But beneath the season's renewal, Elias's work deepened into something more deliberate. He no longer sought only isolated moments. He wanted pairs, arrangements, faces set together in harmony. He began to choose his victims in twos, selecting them for the way their expressions might complement one another in death. He called these harvests in the privacy of his mind, as if gathering not crops, but moments of human stillness at their peak. The first came from a husband and wife, Jacob and Lila Weaver, who had once run the mill. Age had slowed them, and grief over a lost son had carved deep lines into their faces. Elias visited under the guise of checking Jacob's failing heart, offering the pair a shared draught to ease the strain of restless nights. They sat together in their kitchen, hands touching lightly on the table as the warmth seeped into their bodies. Elias worked methodically, lifting Lila's chin to catch the glow of the lantern, pressing Jacob's hand more firmly into hers, shaping their mouths until the tension melted into gentle curves. The resin came next, brushed along the skin like an invisible glaze, sealing the moment before their breathing slowed into nothing. When they were found the next morning seated side by side, the townsfolk spoke of how it seemed they had passed together in a dream. The ritual repeated in different forms: two brothers propped against a fence, a grandmother and grandchild leaning toward each other as if sharing a secret. Each scene was carefully chosen, the setting arranged with an artist's patience. The townspeople, still blind to the pattern, took these pairings as signs of divine mercy. They said the apothecary was blessed to ease such partings. But in his ledger, Elias gave them no names, only numbers, angles, and notes about muscle compliance. He studied how the smiles changed when two faces were posed in proximity, how one could influence the reading of the other. It was no longer enough to capture individuals. He wanted his gallery to speak in unison, a silent hymn of perfected finality. And with every harvest, the town's trust in him grew, not knowing they were feeding the very hands that would one day arrange their own final expressions. By midsummer, the cornfields around Black Hollow rose like green walls, their rustling in the night wind sounding almost like voices. People spoke of a sense of being watched when they walked past after sundown. But in the open daylight, such fears dissolved into laughter. Elias Fallow understood those whispers for what they were, an unspoken awareness that something unseen was moving through their lives. He had been pacing those fields for weeks, a lantern swinging low in his hand, not to light his way, but to cast light on the faces he imagined filling his growing gallery. From the road, his movements looked harmless enough. A man out for air, perhaps inspecting the growth for a farmer he'd befriended. But in truth, Elias used the corn's cover to observe the town without being observed in return. He could stand for long stretches, hidden, watching a family on their porch or a couple walk the path toward the mill. In the distance, voices carried strangely in the warm night air, fragments of laughter or arguments. He noted how expressions changed when people thought they were alone, the masks they dropped when privacy embraced them. These were the faces he wanted most. It was Margaret Hale, a widow since the previous winter, who first began to speak openly of Elias's odd behavior. She had seen him near the cornfield at the edge of her property on 3 separate nights, his lantern held low, his posture still as if listening. When she asked casually at the market if others had noticed, the answers were quick but deflecting. Yes, someone had seen him walking by the fields, but wasn't it just part of his work, gathering plants or herbs? No one wanted to accuse the man who had eased so many passings. Margaret's suspicion was not born only of those sightings. She remembered the day Elias had stopped by after her husband's burial, speaking softly, asking what her husband's face had looked like in his final moments. She had described the faint smile she'd thought was a comfort from God, but now, months later, that detail seemed to interest him too much. The more she thought about it, the more she recalled the way his eyes lingered on her own expressions during their conversations, as though he were cataloging them. Still, Margaret held her thoughts close. In a small place like Black Hollow, rumors could ruin a person faster than the truth could protect them. She decided to watch him as he watched others. From her upstairs window, she would sometimes glimpse his lantern's glow moving slowly through the rows of corn, vanishing and reappearing, always heading back toward the tavern before dawn. The harvest deaths, though no one called them that, continued. Two elderly sisters were found on their porch swing, leaning shoulder to shoulder, faint smiles on their lips as though sharing a pleasant memory. A pair of farm hands were discovered asleep in the hayloft, their heads tilted in mirrored angles as if caught in a shared dream. In each case, Elias had visited them recently with medicine or advice, his presence accepted without question. Margaret began keeping her own quiet ledger, not of faces but of dates and sightings. She marked when she saw him in the fields, when someone died, and when he called on certain homes. The patterns unsettled her, though she lacked the proof to speak aloud. Still, she knew something was wrong. The cornfields kept their secrets, muffling the sound of footsteps and hiding whatever passed within their rows. But at night, when the wind died and the air hung still, the lantern light could be seen again, drifting like a firefly through the green maze. It moved with purpose, pausing, circling, returning, like a predator tracing the edges of its hunting ground. And somewhere deep in those stalks, Elias was already deciding whose smile he would take next. By late summer, the corn had grown tall enough to swallow the horizon, and the heat pressed on Black Hollow with a weight that slowed every movement. The air inside the small wooden schoolhouse was stifling, the smell of chalk and sweat clinging to the walls. It was here, in the single-room building where all the children gathered, that Elias Fallow found his next purpose. He had decided weeks earlier that the purest expressions came not from the old or weary, but from those untouched by the slow corrosion of adulthood. Children's smiles were unpracticed, unshaped by manners or the need to hide discomfort. They were, to Elias, the rawest form of beauty, untarnished, unfiltered, and perfect for his work. But children were more closely watched than anyone else in town. If he was to claim one, he needed a reason to be near them without raising suspicion. That reason came in the form of illness. A mild fever had begun circulating among the younger pupils, leaving parents anxious and the schoolmaster uneasy about keeping classes open. Elias arrived at the schoolhouse one sweltering afternoon with a crate of glass bottles clinking softly inside. He explained that the heat, combined with the fever, could weaken the children if not treated. The tonic, he assured the schoolmaster, would strengthen them and clear their minds for study. It was free, he added, his gift to the community. The children lined up, each receiving a small spoonful from the apothecary. To them it tasted sweet, almost like fruit. The dose was small for most, just enough to make their muscles slacken, their bodies calm, their faces soften into a kind of half-sleep. But for two sisters, Clara and June Morton, Elias measured more carefully, his eyes studying their features as if testing a rare fabric. Clara, the elder at 11, had a quick smile that curved unevenly, as though she was always on the edge of laughter. June, only 8, smiled with her whole face, the corners of her eyes crinkling in pure delight. Together they were a matched set, perfect for one of his harvests. By the time the lesson ended, Clara and June had grown pale and slow, their teacher assuming the heat had taken too much from them. Elias offered to walk them home, insisting the fresh air would help. The path he chose skirted the edge of the cornfields before veering toward an abandoned shed once used for storing seed. Inside, the air was cool and dim. He sat the sisters together at a small wooden table, their hands loosely clasped, their heads gently tilted toward each other. He worked quickly, knowing his window was short. Clara's uneven smile was adjusted just enough to mirror her sister's, the imperfections smoothed into a uniform curve. June's natural joy was fixed in place with delicate pressure along her jaw. When the resin was applied, their expressions locked in harmony. Two faces forever in agreement, two smiles bound in silent conversation. That evening when the sisters were found, the scene was spoken of in hushed reverence. They looked as though they had fallen asleep mid-story, holding hands in the safety of each other's presence. The pastor declared it a sign that God took them together so neither would know loneliness in heaven. Parents held their own children tighter that night, murmuring thanks for the apothecary's kindness in trying to help. No one saw Elias in his upstairs room hours later, sketching the sisters into his ledger. He drew them as they had been in the shed side by side, the smiles perfectly matched. Underneath he wrote only, pair number 6. Harmony achieved. For Elias it was more than a harvest. It was proof that his work could capture not just a moment but a relationship. A unity of expression that made the living seem lesser by comparison. The town saw tragedy. Elias saw perfection. And with that, his appetite for pairs deepened into something even more ambitious. The deaths of Clara and June Morton left Black Hollow heavy with grief, but grief in the town had a strange rhythm. It flared in whispers, then softened into quiet acceptance. People clung to the pastor's words about divine mercy, about God sparing the sisters from loneliness. But Margaret Hale was not comforted. She had seen too much, noticed too many small details others ignored. She remembered the way Elias had passed her in the market the day after the girls were found, his eyes lingering a fraction too long on her face. It wasn't the look of a man sharing sorrow. It was the gaze of someone assessing, measuring, as if she too were being sized for some purpose she did not yet understand. That night she sat at her kitchen table with her own crude ledger, really just a stack of folded paper, marked with dates and names. She noted when she had seen Elias in the cornfields, when he had visited certain homes, and when the deaths followed. The more she wrote, the more the gaps between events seemed too precise to be chance. Margaret decided she needed something tangible, proof that could not be explained away by the pastor's soft words or the town's reluctance to think ill of their apothecary. The opportunity came on a hot afternoon when she feigned illness, asking Elias to call on her at home. She claimed sleeplessness, a pounding heart, a sense of breathlessness. He listened quietly, his hands moving slowly over the bottles in his satchel before selecting one with amber liquid. When he excused himself to fetch water from the pump outside, Margaret moved quickly. His satchel lay on the table, the clasp unfastened. She slipped her hand inside and felt the smooth cover of a leather-bound book. Pulling it halfway into the light, she opened to the first page and froze. Inside were faces, dozens of them, rendered in such precise detail that they seemed almost to breathe. Samuel, the blacksmith's boy, sat upright in death on the page exactly as he had been found. The Weaver couple side by side at their kitchen table, their smiles faint but fixed. Clara and June, their small heads inclined toward each other, their clasped hands sketched with care. Under each drawing were not names but numbers and notes written in neat small script. Angle of mouth, 6 degrees. Chin elevation plus 2 millimeters. Eye focus maintained to last breath. Her hands trembled as she turned more pages, finding blank spaces with faint outlines, faces not yet filled in. One of them was her own. Above it, in the same calm hand, was a single word. Pending. The sound of the pump handle outside broke her trance. She slid the ledger back into the satchel and closed it just as Elias stepped into the doorway. He set the water down and studied her face in silence, his eyes searching for something. She forced a weak smile, pretending the heat had made her dizzy, thanking him for his care. Elias handed her the vial and instructed her to drink half before sleep, the rest at dawn. She promised she would, her fingers closing around the glass. When he left, she poured the liquid into the dirt behind her house. That night, Margaret did not sleep. She sat at her table with her own ledger, copying every name and number she had seen, her mind turning over the reality of what she now knew. Elias was not a healer. He was an arranger, and somewhere in his mind, her place in his gallery was already decided. Would you like me to continue with Chapter 9? The confrontation in candlelight at 700 words, so this turning point hits full force. The following evening, a storm rolled over Black Hollow, the clouds thick and low, pressing the town into shadow long before nightfall. Margaret Hale lit only a single candle in her parlor, its thin glow stretching across the table where she sat waiting. She had spent the day turning over what she had seen in Elias's ledger. The image of her own unfinished face burned into her thoughts. Fear pulled at her, but so did a stubborn resolve. When Elias arrived, he looked as composed as ever, his dark coat still beaded with raindrops. He stepped inside without hesitation, setting his satchel near the chair she had placed opposite her own. Margaret gestured toward it, her voice steady as she thanked him for coming again so soon. "I've been thinking about the way people look right before they pass," she said, her eyes fixed on him. "It's strange, isn't it, how some seem almost content?" Elias tilted his head slightly, the faintest smile on his lips. "Peace is a rare thing," he said softly. "When it appears, it should be preserved." She leaned forward, letting the candlelight catch her face. "Like Samuel, or the Weaver couple, or those girls, Clara and June, their smiles, they weren't natural." Elias didn't flinch at the names. He studied her the way he always had, measuring angles, reading tension. "Ugly deaths," he said, "are an insult to the living. Fear and pain leave faces twisted, degraded. I correct that. I give them something better." Her hands tightened in her lap. "You kill them." "I release them," he said calmly, as if speaking to a stubborn patient. "You think I take life. I take only the ugliness at its end. The last moment should be a gift, Margaret. A gift no one else can give." She felt the weight of his gaze, the sense that he was already imagining her with her head tilted just so, her mouth curved in that perfect, horrifying symmetry. "And me?" she asked. "When were you planning to give me that gift?" His smile widened slightly. "Soon. You would make a fine addition." The candle's flame bent in a draft as the storm rattled the shutters. Margaret forced herself to hold his stare, to keep her breathing steady. She needed him to believe she was unafraid to buy herself time. "Then I suppose," she said slowly, "I'll have to make sure you remember my face exactly as it is now." Elias's eyes flickered. interest, perhaps even amusement. But he said nothing. When he rose to leave, he gathered his satchel with the same deliberate care as always. The door closed softly behind him, but the scent of his damp coat seemed to linger in the air. Margaret sat for a long time after, the candle burning low, knowing the storm outside was nothing compared to the one now moving quietly toward her. Elias Fallow had made his intention clear, and she would have to act before he decided her time had come. The wind arrived before the rain, rushing through Black Hollow like an unseen river. It rattled shutters and howled through the narrow gaps in door frames, carrying with it a fine dust from the cornfields that clung to skin like ash. By nightfall, the storm was in full command, lightning flaring over the horizon, thunder rolling deep enough to make the tavern windows tremble. Margaret Hale had not planned to leave her house that night, but something in the air told her she would not be safe within its walls. She clutched Elias's ledger, stolen hours earlier from his unattended room, and hurried through the rain toward the church, the only place in town where the locks were never turned. The heavy oak doors groaned as she pushed them open, the darkness inside broken only by the glow of a few oil lamps left to burn near the altar. She slipped into a pew, setting the ledger on the bench beside her. The church was cold despite the storm's humid breath, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and candle wax. She tried to steady her breathing, listening to the wind batter the stained glass windows, each gust like the exhale of some great beast circling outside. It was then she heard it, a soft, deliberate creak of the church door. She turned her head slowly, and in the dim light she saw a figure step inside. Elias Fallow closed the door behind him with the same unhurried grace he used for every movement, the storm's roar fading to a muffled backdrop. His coat dripped onto the stone floor, his hat casting his face in shadow. "You've taken something of mine," he said quietly, his voice almost lost under the moan of the wind through the rafters. Margaret's hands tightened on the ledger. "It doesn't belong to you anymore," she replied, though her voice trembled despite her effort to keep it firm. Elias stepped closer, the lamplight catching the pale angles of his face. "It is not a record," he said. "It is my work, my gallery, and you are the final piece." She rose to her feet, holding the ledger as a shield between them. "These are people, Elias. They weren't yours to arrange." He stopped only a few feet away, his expression unreadable. The wind outside surged, rattling the walls, and for a moment it seemed the entire church leaned under the storm's weight. "I gave them beauty," he said. "You'll see. When the moment comes, you won't fight it. You'll thank me." Margaret took a step back, the pew pressing into her legs. "You'll have to kill me first." Elias's eyes softened in a way that was more chilling than any threat. "Not kill. Release." The lamps flickered, and in that instant of dimness he moved, fast but not rushing, his hands reaching for her shoulders. Margaret twisted away, the ledger slipping from her grasp and hitting the floor with a heavy thud. Lightning flared through the stained glass, casting both of their shadows high against the wall. Before he could regain his hold, the great doors at the rear of the church burst open, wind and rain exploding into the room. Voices shouted. Two men from the tavern, drawn by the sight of the light and the knowledge that Margaret had fled her home. Elias stepped back, his gaze never leaving hers, even as the intruders advanced. Without a word, he turned and walked into the gale, his dark coat vanishing into the storm. The men rushed to close the doors against the wind, but by the time they looked outside again, Elias was gone, the rain swallowing all trace of him. Margaret bent to retrieve the ledger, clutching it to her chest. She knew now that Elias would not stop. The black wind had carried him out of the church, but it would carry him back sooner or later. And when it did, she would have to be ready, not just to survive, but to end his work forever. For days after the black windstorm, Black Hollow carried a strange hush, as if the gale had not fully passed, but merely hidden itself in the corners of the town. Elias Fallow was gone. No one had seen him on the roads, at the tavern, or moving through the cornfields. The absence felt unreal, like waking to find a shadow missing from the ground. Margaret Hale kept the ledger locked in a small chest under her bed, though she opened it often, studying the faces inside. The resin-smoothed smiles stared back at her, as vivid as the day they'd been taken. She had shown it to the pastor and the constable, but they saw only drawings. Without the bodies to examine, they called it morbid artistry, unsettling but not proof of murder. The town wanted to believe Elias had simply left, taking his odd habits and his unsettling sketches with him. But within 2 weeks, the river began to bring them back. The first body was a young woman from a settlement upriver, discovered by a pair of fishermen near the bend where the current slowed. She was waterlogged, her dress torn by debris, but her face bore that same unnatural peace. The smile was too perfect, too symmetrical, untouched by the swelling and pallor that drowned bodies usually showed. Even stranger, the skin around her mouth and jaw was firm as if preserved. Then came another and another. Men, women, even a child. None from Black Hollow, but each carrying Elias's unmistakable signature. Word spread quickly through the county, whispers reaching even the farthest farmsteads. Some said the apothecary had moved on to other towns, others that he was drifting along the river itself, taking his victims wherever he stopped to rest. The coroner, summoned from the nearest city, examined the bodies and made notes about a hardening agent applied before death. It resisted decay, locking the muscles in place long after the heart had stopped. He admitted reluctantly that whoever did this understood the body's end as precisely as a surgeon. Margaret attended the inquest for the first 2 bodies, keeping to the back of the room. She said nothing, but each time the coroner described the work, she felt her stomach twist with recognition. She knew this wasn't the end. It was the expansion. Elias had slipped the boundaries of Black Hollow, but he had not abandoned his gallery. He was simply gathering new pieces for it elsewhere. The river became a grim courier carrying reminders of his presence. By late summer, the county kept an unmarked graveyard for the unidentified, rows of wooden crosses with no names. Even there, the smiles endured. The resin, whatever Elias had mixed into it, kept the expressions sharp and lifelike, as if the dead were still mid-thought, about to speak. At night, Margaret would wake and think she heard footsteps outside her window, slow and measured. She would grip the ledger in the dark, her pulse hammering until the sound was gone. She knew the truth the others avoided. Elias was not finished with her. He had told her she would be a fine addition, and men like him did not forget promises. Somewhere beyond the edge of the lamplight, he was working still, smiling politely, offering remedies, shaping faces for his silent, endless choir. And when he returned, the town would not recognize the danger until it was sitting right in front of them, wearing a perfect smile. By the 1870s, decades had passed since Elias Fallow's shadow had last been seen in Black Hollow. But the memory of his work had never fully loosened its hold. The town had aged, grown, and changed, yet certain stories refused to die. They were not told to frighten children into obedience, but whispered between adults in moments when silence felt too heavy. Stories of the apothecary whose patients died smiling, of pears found posed like portraits, of a ledger filled with faces both living and dead. Time had given the tale a soft edge for most, but for Margaret Hale, now stooped with age, it remained sharp. She still kept the ledger locked in a wooden chest, the key worn smooth from decades of her fingers turning it. She had never destroyed it, though she could never explain why. Perhaps it was fear that doing so would not erase Elias's work, or perhaps it was because the ledger felt less like evidence and more like a warning, a thing that needed to exist so people might believe. The world beyond Black Hollow had changed. Railroads brought travelers through the county, and newspapers carried stories from far-off cities. It was in one such paper that Margaret first saw his name again, or rather, she saw him described. In Kansas, a man calling himself an itinerant healer had been linked to several unexplained deaths. Bodies found in their beds, faces fixed in serene smiles, skin strangely resistant to decay. Authorities dismissed the similarities as coincidence. Margaret knew better. Elias had simply stepped into a wider world, a world that had no reason to connect him to a vanished apothecary from Iowa. The ledger's existence finally came to light in 1876, when Margaret, nearing the end of her life, donated it to a small medical college in Des Moines. She told the dean the sketches were the work of a man whose art was a kind of killing, and urged that it be kept as a teaching tool. The drawings unsettled the faculty, who locked the book away in a cabinet normally reserved for rare anatomical studies. It began to circulate quietly among medical students who argued late into the night about whether the perfection of those smiles was a result of some chemical process or an unsettling mastery of human anatomy. In 1881, a traveling lecturer in the field of psychiatry came across the ledger and delivered a paper on it to a small gathering in Chicago. He argued that the work suggested an entirely new category of killer, one not driven by anger or impulse, but by aesthetic obsession. He described it as murder in pursuit of beauty, a phrase that found its way into academic journals. For the first time, Elias's methods were recognized as more than folklore. They became a case study. Black Hollow, meanwhile, erected a modest memorial in the churchyard. A single stone engraved with "For those we lost without knowing." No names were listed, for too many were uncertain. But the townsfolk placed flowers there on certain days without speaking of why. Some of the younger generation dismissed the stories entirely, calling them superstitions of an older, simpler time. Yet each summer, when the wind moved through the cornfields at night, a few of the older residents would glance toward the horizon and fall quiet. Margaret did not live to see it, but in the decades that followed, the ledger inspired further research. Photographers began experimenting with death portraits, preserving the likeness of the newly deceased for their families. In dark corners of that practice, there were whispers of techniques to improve the final expression. And though no one could match the precision in Elias's drawings, the idea that beauty could be imposed on the dead had taken root. For all the progress in science and medicine, no chemical compound or mechanical device could replicate exactly what Elias had done. His recipe for the resin was never found, and those who examined his work closely said it was as much in the hands as in the formula. An ability to manipulate muscles in those final moments without breaking the illusion of peace. It was a skill that, once learned, could not easily be unlearned. In this way, his legacy was not contained in the ledger alone. It lived in the uneasy line between art and violation, in the quiet spaces where life met death. It lived in the suspicion that a perfect smile might not always belong to the living, or even to the one wearing it. And as long as the faces in those pages continued to look back without decay, Elias Fallow's work and the silence it demanded would remain. They say time dulls the edges of even the sharpest horrors. But for those who had known Elias Fallow's work, the memory never truly softened. It only hid itself in quieter corners of the mind. By the close of the century, most in Black Hollow spoke of him only when prompted, as if saying his name might draw his gaze again. The official records called him a suspected poisoner, the sort of clinical understatement that drains evil of its weight. But the people who had seen the smiles, who had buried their dead with those resin-locked expressions, understood something colder. Elias's killings had never been about the taking of life, but about the rearranging of its ending. Margaret Hale's ledger, Elias's ledger, remained in the archives of the Des Moines Medical College, its existence known to a small circle of academics, police investigators, and morbidly curious students. Every decade or so, someone would bring it out again, comparing its sketches to photographs from other cases. Unexplained deaths in distant towns, bodies found posed in chairs, or couples discovered holding hands as though sleeping. More than once, a coroner would admit, quietly off the record, that the similarities were too exact to dismiss. But no one could prove a link. Elias had been too careful, his methods too precise to leave behind anything more than the smile itself. Philosophers and physicians alike debated the nature of his work. Was it cruelty disguised as beauty, or beauty born from cruelty? Could an act be both at once? Some argued that his victims had been robbed of their right to die honestly, that the peace in their faces was a mask imposed by force. Others insisted that, in a grim way, Elias had given them something, had erased fear and left only calm. It was the kind of moral question that could never truly be answered, yet it lingered, uncomfortable and unresolved. For the people of Black Hollow, the question was simpler. Evil often comes wearing the clothes of kindness. Elias had been polite, attentive, generous with his remedies. He had listened to their troubles, remembered their names, spoken gently even to the poorest child. And behind all of it, he had been arranging them in his mind, measuring their smiles, deciding where they would fit in his silent gallery. It was not rage or hatred that had driven him. It was vision. That was what made him dangerous. Over the years, rumors would surface. A healer in the Dakotas, a traveling chemist in Missouri, a man in his later years with steady hands and a face that seemed somehow too smooth for his age. Each time, the reports faded before anyone could confirm them. Perhaps he had died long ago, his secrets buried with him. Or perhaps he had simply grown more selective, his gallery expanding at a pace too slow to notice. In the end, Elias Fallow's story became less about the man himself and more about the shadow he cast. It was a reminder that perfection can be a trap, that beauty can be used as a weapon. Death, when stripped of its truth, becomes something unnatural, something that lingers not in the body but in the mind of those left behind. As for the ledger, it still rests in its locked cabinet, its pages unchanged by time. The smiles within are as sharp as the day they were drawn, untouched by decay, untouched by doubt. They wait, silent, as if aware that their creator's hand might one day return to add another face to their number. And so the question lingers, carried in quiet voices from one generation to the next. If a stranger offered you peace at the end, would you take it, knowing it might come at the cost of your last truth? Or would you resist, even if it meant leaving the world with fear still in your eyes? Because somewhere, perhaps, Elias Fallow is still waiting for an answer.